Linda Cartwright's face went pale as the intercom crackled overhead. "Miss Cartwright, report to the cockpit, immediately." A murmur rippled through first class. Passengers shifted in their seats, some exchanging glances, others pretending not to hear. But Jordan and Xavier Caldwell heard it loud and clear, and so did every other person who had watched them be escorted off this plane. Linda's hands trembled as she walked toward the front of the cabin, feeling the weight of their eyes on her. She had spent years commanding first class with authority, but now she felt like she was the one being watched. She stepped into the cockpit, her heart pounding. Captain Aldrin didn't look up from his controls. His voice was calm, but edged with steel. "Miss Cartwright, I need you to listen carefully." She swallowed. "Yes, Captain." Aldrin finally turned, his expression unreadable. "The boys you removed from first class? Their father is Richard Caldwell, the CEO of this airline." The blood drained from Linda's face. Her breath caught in her throat. Aldrin leaned in slightly. "You made a choice, and now you're going to fix it." Moments later, Linda stood stiffly in front of Jordan and Xavier, the entire cabin silent as they watched her. Passengers who had ignored the boys' removal now leaned in, curious to see how this would play out. "I apologize," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jordan tilted his head. "For what, exactly?" Linda's lips parted, but no words came out. Xavier crossed his arms. "Because I don't remember you questioning anyone else's seat." Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Linda forced the words out. "I assumed you didn't belong, and I was wrong." Jordan held her gaze for a long moment before finally leaning back in his seat. "Yeah, you were." And just like that, the power had shifted. Linda turned quickly, her face burning, and disappeared toward the galley. But as Jordan settled into his seat, sipping the orange juice a flight attendant hastily placed in front of him, he knew one thing for sure. She would never forget this moment, and neither would anyone else on this flight. If this story hit home, drop a 1 in the comments. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment like this? Speak up, let's talk about it, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Justice deserves to be seen. The airport buzzed with life. Announcements crackled over the intercom, the hum of conversation filled the air, and the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases echoed against the polished floors. Families hurried past, business travelers balanced coffee cups and cell phones, and children clung to stuffed animals as their parents corralled them toward boarding gates. In the middle of it all, Jordan Caldwell walked with the effortless confidence of someone who belonged anywhere he stepped. At 16, he had the quiet self-assurance of an older brother who had long accepted his role as protector. Xavier, his 14-year-old younger brother, walked slightly ahead, his excitement barely contained. "First class, bro?" Xavier grinned, gripping the straps of his backpack. "We're about to fly like kings." Jordan smirked, but kept his pace measured. "Yeah, well, don't act like you've never seen legroom before." Xavier shot him a playful glare. "Easy for you to say, mister. I'm too cool to get excited." "You're hyped too, I can tell." Jordan rolled his eyes, but didn't deny it. Their father, Richard Caldwell, had surprised them with first-class tickets as a reward for their hard work in school. It wasn't just a vacation, it was a milestone, a reminder that their efforts were paying off. Their father had always told them, "Success isn't just about getting through the door. It's about making sure you leave it open for the next person." Jordan lived by that. Xavier was still getting there, but his enthusiasm was contagious. As they made their way through the terminal, subtle shifts in the atmosphere followed them. Shifts they were both used to, but never quite got used to. A woman in a crisp navy mule blazer pulled her purse closer when Xavier walked past. A businessman, engrossed in his laptop, glanced up, saw them, and did a double take before looking back down. Two teenage girls whispered to each other, their eyes lingering on the boys a second too long. Jordan felt it, even when no words were spoken. The unspoken questions, the silent assessments. Why are they here? Do they really belong? Xavier, too caught up in his excitement, didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he chose not to. As they approached their gate, the energy shifted again. A group of first-class passengers stood near the priority boarding lane. Older couples, well-dressed professionals, and a few families wrangling restless kids. Jordan and Xavier joined the line, handing over their boarding passes when prompted. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with expertly styled blonde hair, took their tickets. She scanned them without expression, but the moment she looked at the seating assignment, something changed. "First class?" she said, almost like she needed to confirm it out loud. Jordan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She hesitated, just for a second, then forced a tight smile. "Enjoy your flight." Jordan took the tickets back, feeling a weight settle in his chest. It was always like this. The pause, the moment of disbelief. Xavier either missed it or chose to ignore it. "Let's go, man. I want to see how big these seats really are." They stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool air a stark contrast to the warm, bustling terminal. The scent of airplane fuel and fresh coffee greeted them. As they entered the plane, first class unfolded before them like a dream. Wide leather seats, glowing ambient lighting, and passengers sipping champagne as flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles. Xavier's eyes widened. "Yo, this is crazy." Jordan allowed himself a small smile. Yeah, it was. As they reached seats 2A and 2B, they could feel eyes on them again. Another shift in the air. Unspoken curiosity. Silent judgment. Xavier collapsed into his seat, running his hands over the plush armrest. "Bro, this is nicer than Dad's car." Jordan chuckled, shaking his head. He reached up to place his bag in the overhead bin when he caught a movement in his peripheral vision. A flight attendant, Linda Cartwright, was walking down the aisle, her sharp gaze scanning the cabin. When she saw them, she stopped. Her expression tightened. And just like that, Jordan knew. This wasn't over. Linda Cartwright moved with the precision of someone who had done this job for years, her every motion efficient, her uniform crisp. She prided herself on keeping first class in order, ensuring the right passengers were in the right seats and making sure everything ran smoothly. So when she glanced up from her checklist and saw them, she hesitated. 2 boys, alone, young, black, seated comfortably in first class. Something about the sight made her pause. It wasn't intentional, not in the way she would have admitted out loud, but a thought flickered through her mind before she could push it away. They must have made a mistake. Her eyes flicked toward the front of the cabin, scanning for their parents. Maybe a mother fumbling with a carry-on, or a father in a pressed suit checking his watch. But there was no one. She set her clipboard down and walked toward them. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite but firm as she stopped beside their seats. Jordan looked up first, his sharp eyes immediately assessing her. Xavier, still adjusting his seatbelt, didn't seem to sense the shift in energy. "Yes?" Jordan asked, his tone even. Linda offered a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" Xavier grinned, oblivious to the weight of the question. "Oh yeah, we're in the right seats. These are amazing." Jordan, however, wasn't smiling. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his boarding pass. "We're in 2A and 2B, he said, handing it to her without hesitation. Linda took the ticket, flipping it over once, then again, her brows drawing together as if she expected something to be wrong. The seat assignment was clear. First class. No mistakes. Still, something felt off to her. "Where are your parents?" she asked, looking from Jordan to Xavier. Xavier's smile faded slightly, his excitement dimming. "We're traveling alone," Jordan said, his voice careful now. Linda didn't like that answer. Alone? 2 boys? In first class? It didn't make sense. She knew she should let it go. The tickets were valid, and she had no real reason to question them further. But something deep, something unconscious and unspoken, whispered, "Check again. Be sure." "I'll be right back," she said, her fingers still clutching their boarding passes. As she turned and walked toward the front of the cabin, she was already certain something was wrong, and she was going to fix it. Linda reached the front of the cabin, her grip tightening around the boarding passes as she approached Derek Benson, the senior flight attendant. He was older, experienced, and someone she had worked with for years. If something was off, he would back her up. "Derek," she murmured, lowering her voice. "I need a second opinion." He glanced up from the pre-flight checklist. "What's going on?" She handed him the tickets. 2 kids, alone, in first class. Derek scanned the boarding passes, his brows furrowing. "And?" Linda crossed her arms. "Doesn't it seem, I don't know, off? First class is expensive. These seats aren't usually booked for unaccompanied minors, let alone—" She cut herself off, but Derek heard it anyway. "Let alone who?" He exhaled, glancing toward the aisle where the boys sat, completely unaware they were under scrutiny. "Did you check the manifest?" "I was about to." "Did you ask the gate agent?" Linda hesitated, then straightened. "Look, I just need you to back me up on this. They're alone, no parents in sight, and something just doesn't feel right." Derek frowned, but Linda had worked beside him long enough that he trusted her instincts. He handed back the tickets with a sigh. "If you think something's wrong, then do what you need to do." That was all she needed. Linda turned on her heel, heading straight for Jordan and Xavier, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. As she approached, passengers started to notice. A man in a navy suit lowered his newspaper slightly. A woman in pearls exchanged a glance with her husband. No one said anything, but the tension shifted. Linda stopped at their row. "I'm going to need you both to come with me." Xavier blinked. "What? What?" "There's been a mistake with your seating," she said, her voice leaving no room for discussion. Jordan's jaw tightened. "What mistake?" Linda held out her hand. "Please, grab your things." Xavier looked between Linda and his brother, his confusion turning to frustration. "But we have our tickets." "Let's not make this difficult," Linda interrupted. Passengers were listening now, shifting in their seats, but still, no one spoke up. Xavier's hands balled into fists. "This isn't right." Jordan placed a hand on his brother's arm, a silent message, "Not here, not now." He took a slow breath, schooling his features into something neutral. He knew how this worked. Fighting wouldn't get them anywhere. Without another word, he grabbed his backpack. Xavier hesitated, but when Jordan gave him a look, he huffed and did the same. The walk down the aisle was longer than it should have been. Jordan could feel the stares, the silent curiosity. He knew what they were thinking. They must have done something wrong. They must not have belonged there in the first place. A few passengers avoided eye contact. Others stole glances and quickly looked away. But not one person spoke up. And that, more than anything, made Jordan's stomach turn. They were off the plane. The cold reality of it sank in as Jordan and Xavier sat stiffly in the waiting area near the gate, backpacks at their feet, an occasional traveler passing by without a second glance. The murmurs from the first-class cabin still echoed in Jordan's mind, the weight of their silence pressing on his chest. He had heard it before, the hushed whispers, the unspoken assumptions, the looks that said, "You don't belong here," without a word needing to be spoken. But this was something else. Xavier, hunched over his phone, furiously typing, had not said a word since they were escorted off. His fingers moved so fast over the screen, Jordan was sure he was pounding the keys. "Xavier? Dad? They kicked us out of first class, said there was a mistake." He hit send. Jordan exhaled slowly, leaning back against the rigid airport chair. He didn't need to look at his brother to know Xavier was fuming. The tension radiated off him, his knee bouncing rapidly, his breath coming fast. "Dad's gonna be pissed," Xavier muttered. Jordan didn't respond. He kept his eyes forward, watching as a group of passengers strolled through the terminal, their conversations light, unbothered. They had no idea what had just happened. Xavier's phone buzzed in his hand. He snatched it up immediately. "Dad, what flight number?" Xavier's jaw tightened. "Oh, now it's over," he murmured under his breath, sending the details. Jordan finally turned toward him. "Don't make this worse," he warned. Xavier's head snapped up. "Worse? They just threw us off the plane like we were criminals, Jordan, and we did nothing wrong." "I know," Jordan said, his voice level, though his own anger was simmering just beneath the surface. "But throwing a fit right now isn't going to fix anything." Xavier huffed, shaking his head, eyes dark with frustration. "You always do this, always act like if we just stay calm everything will be fine, but look where we are. It doesn't matter how calm we are." Jordan clenched his fists in his lap. He wanted to yell too, to throw something, to demand answers. But he knew how the world worked. He knew what happened when people like them made too much noise. And besides, he didn't need to yell. Their father would handle it. Another message came through. Xavier read it, then turned the screen toward Jordan. "Dad, stay where you are, I'm handling it." Jordan let out a slow breath. "Told you." Xavier shook his head but said nothing. His fingers hovered over his phone. Then, almost out of habit, he scrolled to their father's name in his contacts and typed one last message. "Xavier, make him pay for this?" Jordan glanced at the screen, but he didn't stop him. "Because for once," he agreed. Richard Caldwell sat at his desk, his office illuminated by the soft glow of his computer screen. The skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a breathtaking view that once symbolized everything he had built. But at this moment, he wasn't focused on the city, the contracts, or the million-dollar deals waiting for his approval. His phone vibrated on the polished oak desk, a simple message. "Xavier, they kicked us out of first class. Said there was a mistake." His hand tightened around the phone. Another vibration. "Xavier, make them pay for this." Richard's chest tightened. His fingers gripped the phone a little harder than necessary as he read the words again, his mind processing them in pieces. Kicked out, first class, mistake. His sons had been humiliated. For a brief moment, the world around him faded. The hum of the office outside his door, the distant sound of ringing phones, the murmur of his assistants handling the day's workload. None of it mattered. He took a slow breath, placed his phone on the desk, and exhaled through his nose. It wasn't just that his sons had been removed from their seats. It wasn't just that there had been a supposed mistake. It was why. Because they had been seen before they had been considered, judged before they had been acknowledged. A knock at the door. His assistant, Rebecca, stepped in, her usual confident expression faltering when she saw his face. "Sir?" His voice was calm, but there was a razor's edge beneath it. "Get Dorian Vance on the phone. Now." Rebecca hesitated for half a second before nodding. "Right away." Richard sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable as his phone rang once, twice, before a deep, steady voice answered. "Dorian Vance." Richard didn't waste time. "My sons were just removed from a first-class flight. I need an immediate report on what happened." There was a beat of silence. Richard could picture Dorian sitting up a little straighter, already scrawling through the internal system to see what flight he was referring to. "Which flight, sir?" Dorian asked, his voice carefully neutral. Richard gave him the number. The sound of typing filled the other end of the line. Another pause. Then Dorian let out a slow breath. "Sir? I don't see any reports of an issue with their booking. Their seats were correctly assigned." Richard's jaw tightened. Then why were they removed? More typing. The pause was longer this time. Dorian's voice, still calm, but something in his tone had changed. "It looks like a senior flight attendant made the call," he said carefully. "Linda Cartwright. She flagged them as a possible seat assignment error and had them escorted off." Richard inhaled deeply through his nose, controlling the surge of anger clawing its way up his chest. He wasn't surprised. He had seen this happen before, in different forms, under different circumstances. But knowing it had happened to his sons, on his airline, made his blood run cold. "Where are they now?" His voice was dangerously calm. "Still at the gate," Dorian confirmed. Richard closed his eyes briefly before opening them again, his decision made. "Listen carefully. I want the flight crew notified immediately. The boys are to be brought back to first class. No hesitation, no excuses. And I want a full internal report on my desk within the hour." "Understood, sir," Dorian said, his voice more alert now. "And the flight attendant?" Richard's grip on his pen tightened. "She has no idea what she's just done," he said evenly, "but she's about to find out." Captain James Aldrin adjusted the controls in the cockpit, his focus sharp as he prepared for takeoff. Years of experience had made this routine second nature. The calculations, the pre-flight checks, the quiet anticipation before the aircraft roared down the runway. But today something felt off. His radio crackled to life, and he reached for it, expecting a routine clearance update. Instead, a low, controlled voice came through. "This is Dorian Vance, VP of Airline Operations. Captain Aldrin, we have an urgent situation." Aldrin's brows furrowed. "Go ahead." "We have just received a direct call from corporate headquarters. 2 unaccompanied minors were removed from first class under the direction of a senior flight attendant. Can you confirm?" Aldrin straightened. He had noticed the removal, had seen the 2 boys walking back down the jet bridge, but he hadn't been informed of any major seating issues. If this was reaching corporate before takeoff, something had gone terribly wrong. "Confirmed," he said carefully. "I wasn't made aware of any conflict, but I did see 2 minors escorted off." There was a pause. Then Dorian's next words landed like a thunderclap. "Captain," he said, his voice measured, deliberate, "those boys belong to Richard Caldwell." Aldrin's stomach dropped. "The CEO?" His grip on the radio tightened, the full weight of the mistake hitting him like a freight train. This wasn't just an error. This wasn't just a seating mix-up. This was about to become a public relations disaster. Aldrin's mind raced through the implications. A first-class flight, 2 black teenagers, a wrongful removal, and their father, one of the most powerful figures in the airline industry, finding out before the plane had even left the gate. He took a steadying breath, keeping his voice controlled. "Understood. What are my orders?" Dorian didn't hesitate. "The boys are to be brought back to first class immediately. I don't care if they're already seated in economy. I don't care what excuse was made. Get them back in their original seats. And Captain, yes, there will be consequences." Aldrin's jaw tightened. There was only one person on this plane who had made the call to remove those kids, and she was about to answer for it. Without another word, he reached for the intercom, his voice coming over the speakers, calm but undeniable in its authority. "Ms. Cartwright, report to the cockpit, immediately." He let go of the button, knowing full well that the entire plane had heard the announcement. And somewhere in the first-class cabin, Linda Cartwright was going pale. Linda Cartwright felt her breath catch the moment the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "Miss Cartwright, report to the cockpit, immediately." The words lingered in the air, heavier than they should have been. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats, some exchanging quick glances, others pretending not to have heard. But she felt their curiosity, their unease. Her grip tightened around the clipboard in her hands as she straightened her posture. She didn't like being summoned like this, not in front of everyone. For the first time that morning, something uneasy twisted in her stomach. She forced herself to walk briskly, her heels clicking against the carpeted aisle as she made her way forward. This was nothing. A routine check-in. She had done her job. She had followed protocol. Hadn't she? But as she neared the cockpit door, she caught a glimpse of Bennett, the senior flight attendant, standing by the galley. His face was grim, his arms crossed. He knew something. Her hand hesitated on the cockpit door handle. And then, before she could think twice, she stepped inside. Captain James Aldrin sat stiffly in his chair, his posture tense, his hands clasped in front of him. The air inside the cockpit was different, thick, charged with something she didn't yet understand. He didn't greet her, didn't offer so much as a glance before speaking. "Miss Cartwright," he said, voice clipped. "Explain to me why you removed 2 unaccompanied minors from first class." Linda blinked. That was not what she had expected. There was a seating issue," she started, gripping her clipboard a little too tightly. 2 minors were traveling alone, and I wasn't informed. I assumed. There was a mistake in the... "You assumed?" Aldrin's tone cut through her like a blade. Linda swallowed, suddenly aware of how wrong that sounded. I mean, I followed standard procedure. Did you check the passenger manifest?" She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She hadn't. Aldrin's eyes narrowed. "Did you confirm with the gate agent before making that call?" Her fingers curled around her clipboard. I checked their tickets, and I thought..." "You thought?" His voice was sharp now, like he was challenging her to lie to him. She pressed her lips together. The silence between them was deafening. "You didn't check the manifest. You didn't verify with the gate agent. You didn't even stop to consider that those boys had every right to be there, did you?" Linda's chest tightened. Captain Aldrin exhaled, shaking his head. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less firm. "The 2 passengers you removed," he said slowly, deliberately, "are Jordan and Xavier Caldwell. Their father is Richard Caldwell." Linda's heart stopped. She felt the blood drain from her face as the full weight of those words slammed into her. Richard Caldwell, the CEO of this airline. The world tilted beneath her feet. Aldrin's next words sealed it. "You made a choice, Miss Cartwright, and now you're going to fix it." Linda stood frozen, her breath shallow, as the weight of Captain Aldrin's words crushed her. "Those boys, they belong to the CEO of this airline." Her stomach dropped. A cold wave of panic crawled up her spine, tightening around her throat. The sheer magnitude of what she had done slammed into her with the force of a runaway train. Richard Caldwell. Not just any passenger, not some random executive, the man who owned the airline. She had humiliated his sons. On his plane, her mind raced, grasping at any excuse, any possible way to explain herself. But nothing came. Aldrin's eyes were still locked on her, sharp and unreadable. "Tell me something, Miss Cartwright," he said, voice controlled but laced with something dangerous. "At what point did you think to verify their tickets? Before or after you decided they didn't belong?" Linda felt the heat of shame spread across her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came. "That's what I thought," Aldrin said coldly. The silence in the cockpit was suffocating. "You're going to return to those boys," he continued, his voice like steel, "and you're going to apologize, properly. And when this plane lands, you'll answer directly to corporate. Do you understand me?" Linda clenched her fists at her sides. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to say she had just been following protocol, but deep down she knew the truth. This wasn't protocol. This was assumption, and now she was about to pay for it. "Do you understand me?" Aldrin repeated, each word clipped, precise. Linda swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Yes, Captain." "Then fix your mistake," he said, already turning away from her. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door handle. The moment she stepped out of the cockpit, the energy in the cabin shifted. Passengers were watching her now. Some subtly peered over their newspapers and phones. Others openly stared, murmuring to each other. They had heard. They knew something had happened. Linda's legs felt like lead as she walked back down the aisle. For the first time in her career, she felt exposed, like the very foundation she had built for herself was crumbling beneath her feet. She reached row 15 in the economy section. The boys sat stiffly in their seats, their faces unreadable, their backpacks resting at their feet. Jordan saw her first. His eyes flickered with something cold, something far older than 16 years should carry. Xavier noticed next, sitting up a little straighter, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. Linda forced a breath through her lungs and crouched slightly to meet their eye level. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice measured but strained. "I'd like to escort you both back to your original seats in first class." Xavier's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Now, you want us back?" Jordan studied her, his expression giving away nothing. "What changed?" Linda's jaw tightened. She wanted to end this quickly, to smooth things over, to make this moment disappear. But the way Jordan was looking at her, he wasn't going to let that happen. She swallowed her pride. "It was a mistake," she said. Xavier tilted his head. "A mistake? You saw our tickets," Jordan added, "and you still didn't believe us." The cabin was silent now. Passengers weren't even pretending to look away anymore. Linda pressed her lips together. "I may have misjudged the situation," she admitted, the words burning on her tongue. "But I'd like to correct it now." Jordan and Xavier exchanged a glance. "You didn't just misjudge," Jordan said evenly. "You embarrassed us. In front of everyone." Linda felt the heat rise to her face. She wanted to move past this, to make them stand up, to get them back to first class so she could breathe again. Instead, she was stuck here, forced to face the ugly truth. Xavier leaned back slightly. "Dad told us to take our time," he said casually, looking at Jordan. "So, maybe we shouldn't be in a hurry." Jordan smirked slightly. "Yeah," he agreed. "Maybe we should make sure we actually belong here first." Linda's stomach twisted. "Of course," she said stiffly. "I'll give you a moment." She straightened and walked away quickly, her hands clammy, her chest tight. Passengers were still watching her. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one in control, and she hated it. Linda's steps felt heavier than they ever had before. Each movement forward felt like a spotlight was on her, though no one said a word. As she walked back through first class, the tension was thick, suffocating. The same passengers who had quietly watched the boys being removed were now watching her, but their expressions had changed. Some were blank, unreadable. Others, unmistakable judgment. A woman in seat 3D who had looked confused when Jordan and Xavier were taken away, now sat with her arms crossed, lips pressed together. Disapproval. The businessman in seat 4A, who had flicked through his emails earlier, now glanced at her with thinly veiled contempt before looking away. No one said anything, but she felt it. For years, she had been the one making decisions, keeping order, moving through first class with authority and control. Now she was the one under scrutiny. She forced herself to keep moving, though her hands felt clammy, her heart hammering in her chest. When she reached row 2, her breath caught. Jordan and Xavier sat exactly where they were supposed to be, all along. Jordan leaned back in his seat, arms resting comfortably on the armrests, his posture cool, calculated. Xavier, on the other hand, sat forward, elbows on his knees, looking at her with a mix of amusement and defiance. They weren't angry. They weren't flustered. They had already won. Linda's throat felt dry. For the first time in her career, she didn't know what to say. She cleared her throat, then crouched slightly to their eye level, trying to force control back into her voice. "I apologize," she said, the words stiff, mechanical. "I misjudged the situation. That was an error on my part." Xavier raised an eyebrow. "An error?" Jordan tilted his head slightly, eyes locked on hers. Or a choice? Linda froze. The cabin was silent. Everyone heard that. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Xavier sat back. Because I don't remember you asking anyone else in first class for their tickets. Just us. Linda's face burned. She could feel the heat crawling up her neck into her cheeks. I made an assumption, she admitted, her voice quieter now. Jordan exhaled through his nose, looking almost bored. You mean you assumed we didn't belong? Xavier's fingers drummed against the armrest. Would you have done the same thing if we looked different? A ripple of discomfort moved through the nearby passengers. Linda's lips parted, but nothing came out. What could she say? No. It would be a lie, and they both knew it. Yes. Then she would have to say it out loud. To admit it, in front of everyone. She said nothing. The silence stretched long enough for a few passengers to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Jordan let the moment hang for a second longer before nodding once. That's what I thought. Xavier exhaled through his nose, shaking his head before finally reclining in his seat. Took you long enough? Linda clenched her fists. She wanted this to be over, wanted to escape the burning shame creeping under her skin, but she couldn't move. Jordan's eyes met hers one last time. His voice was calm, controlled, but the weight behind it was undeniable. If you're going to apologize, he said smoothly, make sure it's not just because you got caught. The words landed like a gut punch. A quiet gasp came from somewhere in the cabin. A man shifted in his seat. Someone cleared their throat. And just like that, the power had shifted. Linda wasn't in charge anymore. She swallowed hard, forced a nod, and stood stiffly. I understand, she muttered, though the words tasted bitter. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Each step back toward the galley felt heavier than the last. She barely made it past the curtain before her hands began to shake. She gripped the counter, inhaled sharply, forcing herself to steady her breathing. She had been in difficult situations before, angry passengers, turbulence emergencies, high-stress moments where she had been in control. But this, she had never felt this before. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure she could fix this. Linda stood behind the curtain of the galley, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded, her breaths shallow, her mind racing through the last few minutes. The silence, the stares, Jordan's words still ringing in her ears. If you're going to apologize, make sure it's not just because you got caught. She had walked away, but there was nowhere to hide. Not from the truth, not from the realization gnawing at her ribs. She had done this before. Not like this. Not this public, not this humiliating. But she had looked at people and made assumptions. People who didn't look like they belonged in first class. People who she had questioned without realizing why. But now, everyone saw it. And worse, so did she. She inhaled sharply and turned back toward the cabin, her legs feeling heavier than before. This wasn't over. Not yet. The murmurs in first class faded as she stepped forward. Passengers who had pretended not to notice now lifted their heads, their gazes flicking between her and the boys. Some looked away quickly, uncomfortable, as if realizing they had played a role in this too through their silence. Jordan and Xavier were still seated, calm, in control. She stopped in front of them, forcing herself to meet their eyes. Jordan watched her with that same sharp, unreadable expression. Xavier sat with his arms crossed, waiting. She took a slow breath and spoke, not rehearsed, not deflecting. I made an assumption, she said, her voice quieter than before, but it carried through the cabin. And it was wrong. A ripple of reaction moved through the nearby passengers. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. A woman pursed her lips, folding her arms. A businessman at the window lowered his newspaper, finally looking at her directly. Linda swallowed. the weight of their attention pressing against her ribs. "I didn't check the manifest. I didn't verify with the gate agent. I saw you," she hesitated, forcing herself to say it, "and I made a decision before I had the facts." Xavier exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Jordan remained quiet, waiting. "I'm sorry," Linda continued, and for the first time, she meant it. A moment passed, then Jordan tilted his head slightly. "For what exactly?" Linda flushed. He wasn't going to let her take the easy way out. "For questioning your right to be here," she admitted. "For making you feel like you didn't belong." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers were grappling with what they had just witnessed, some realizing they had watched the entire thing unfold and said nothing. A man in seat 4A, the one who had kept his head down earlier, cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. The woman in seat 3D, who had asked questions before, shook her head slightly, lips pressed into a thin line. Linda had been the one to act, but the entire cabin had been complicit in their silence. Xavier exhaled, uncrossing his arms. "Took you long enough?" he muttered. Jordan nodded once. "That's better." And just like that, it was over. But the lesson wasn't. Linda straightened, feeling the shift in power, knowing she would never stand in first class the same way again. Because this moment, he would never forget it. Have you ever been in a moment where you were judged unfairly? Where someone looked at you and made up their mind about you before you even had a chance to prove who you were? If you have, then you know exactly what Jordan and Xavier felt in that moment. The embarrassment, the anger, the feeling that no matter what you do, no matter how much you work, no matter how much you prove yourself, someone will still decide you don't belong. And maybe worst of all, the silence of those around you. Not the person who discriminated, not the person who acted on their bias, but the ones who saw it and said nothing. How did it make you feel? Did you want to shrink away, disappear, pretend it didn't happen so you wouldn't have to deal with it? Or did you want to stand up, fight back, demand the respect you should have never been denied in the first place? These stories matter because they don't just happen on airplanes. They happen in classrooms, in offices, in stores, on sidewalks. They happen every day. And every time they happen, there are two choices. Stay silent, or make sure they never forget you. If this has ever happened to you, drop your story in the comments. Because the more we talk about it, the less they can pretend it doesn't happen. Jordan and Xavier weren't going to be quiet about it, and neither should you. Jordan stood, rolling his shoulders like he had all the time in the world. Xavier grabbed his backpack, slinging it over one shoulder, before stretching his arms with an exaggerated sigh. They weren't in a rush. The first time they had walked down this aisle, their steps had been heavy with humiliation, the whispers surrounding them. This time, the whispers weren't about them. Passengers sat a little stiffer, their gazes flicking toward the galley where Linda had disappeared. Some exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. Jordan didn't need to hear what they were saying. He already knew. Xavier smirked, nudging his brother. "Think she's regretting it yet?" Jordan exhaled through his nose, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Doesn't matter. Because whether she regretted it or not, she would never forget it. And neither would anyone else on this flight." Richard Caldwell stepped out of the sleek black car, his expression unreadable as he approached the towering corporate headquarters of his airline. The glass doors reflected the city skyline behind him, but Richard wasn't here to admire the view. He was here to set things right. Inside, the executive floor was already on edge. A group of high-ranking officials stood near the conference room, waiting, their postures stiff, their faces tight with unease. They knew why he was here. The moment he entered, the tension thickened. Dorian Vance was the first to approach, his voice measured but careful. "Mr. Caldwell," he greeted with a nod. "The internal report is being finalized as we speak. We've reviewed the incident." Richard didn't stop walking. "I don't need a report to tell me what happened. The room fell silent as he reached the head of the long, polished conference table. He placed his hands flat against the surface, his gaze sweeping over the executives. "You already know what I want to hear," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Tell me what steps are being taken to make sure this never happens again." The executives exchanged glances. A man with silver-rimmed glasses cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. "We've already spoken to the flight crew involved. The employee responsible—" Richard's eyes snapped to him. "You mean the employee who assumed my sons didn't belong in first class? The employee who publicly humiliated them without verifying a single fact?" The man hesitated. "Yes, sir. She has been placed on immediate leave, pending further disciplinary action." Richard's jaw tightened. "That's not enough." The room went still. Dorian folded his arms. "What do you suggest, sir?" Richard straightened, his presence commanding. "This is bigger than one flight attendant. This is about how people in this company are trained to think. I want a full-scale policy review on how discrimination is handled in this airline. Every employee, from corporate to cabin crew, will undergo mandatory bias training, effective immediately." Another executive shifted in his seat. "With all due respect, Mr. Caldwell, implementing changes on that scale will take time." "Then start now," Richard interrupted. His voice wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. It carried the kind of weight that left no room for argument. Silence stretched. Then, one by one, the executives nodded. Richard exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. His sons had already won the battle. Now, he was making sure they won the war. Richard Caldwell entered the executive boardroom with the kind of controlled presence that made people sit straighter. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to announce his anger. It was felt. The room, filled with top executives, had already fallen into an uneasy silence. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Dorian Vance stood near the window, arms crossed, watching as Richard took his place at the head of the table. His expression gave nothing away, but he had worked for Richard long enough to know what was coming. A man with silver-rimmed glasses finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Caldwell, first, let me say that we take this matter very seriously. The employee in question—" Richard cut him off with a look. "This is not about one employee," he said evenly. "This is about a culture that allowed this to happen." The air in the room shifted. Richard placed his hands flat on the table, his tone calm but unforgiving. 2 paying passengers were removed from first class, not because they violated policy, not because they caused a disturbance, but because someone looked at them and decided they didn't belong, and no one, not a single person, spoke up. Some of the executives avoided his gaze. Others held it but said nothing. Richard exhaled slowly, his voice steady. "You know what the worst part is?" He let the question hang for a beat. "This wasn't an accident. It was a decision. And if it happened to my sons, how many others has it happened to?" A woman near the end of the table shifted uncomfortably. Richard straightened. "This company runs on trust. Trust that we treat every passenger with dignity, that we don't let personal bias dictate company policy. That stops today." Dorian spoke for the first time. "What do you propose?" Richard looked directly at him. "Mandatory bias training for every employee, from corporate to cabin crew. A new policy that requires verification before removal from any class seating, and an internal task force to investigate discrimination complaints. Because if this happened once, I guarantee it's happened before." A few executives hesitated. One man frowned. "Sir, with all due respect, implementing that will take—" "Start now." Richard's voice wasn't loud, but it was final. No one argued. Dorian nodded, already pulling out his phone to start making the calls. Richard exhaled, pushing away the tension coiled in his chest. His sons had already won the battle. Now, he was making sure no one else had to fight it again. Richard Caldwell stood at the head of the conference table. his gaze sweeping over the room of executives. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others kept their expressions carefully neutral. But no one looked truly at ease. Good. Because what happened to Jordan and Xavier wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a reflection of something far deeper, something that stretched far beyond this one flight, this one airline, or even this one moment. He took a steady breath before speaking. His voice was calm, deliberate, but there was no mistaking the power behind it. "This isn't just about my sons," he said. "This is about the fact that no matter how successful, how educated, or how accomplished a person of color is, we are still expected to prove that we belong in spaces we've already earned." A weighted silence settled over the room. Jordan and Xavier shouldn't have had to defend their right to sit in seats that were already theirs. But that flight attendant didn't see two paying passengers. She saw two black boys sitting where she didn't expect them to be. And that was all it took for her to make a decision that embarrassed them in front of an entire cabin of people. Not because she had proof, not because there was an issue, but because of what she assumed. A few executives exchanged glances. One man straightened his tie. Another cleared his throat, as if that would somehow lessen the tension building in the room. Richard leaned forward slightly, his tone unwavering. "And you know what the worst part is?" He let the question linger, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. No one stopped her. A woman near the middle of the table looked down at her notepad. Another adjusted his cufflinks. "You see, that's how discrimination survives," Richard continued. "It's not just in the people who make the wrong decisions. It's in the people who see it happening and say nothing. In the passengers who sat there, watching my sons be humiliated and chose to stay quiet. In the staff who let them be removed without so much as a second glance." He straightened, letting the weight of his words sink in. Accountability applies to everyone, from the flight attendant who made the decision to the executives in this room who allow these kinds of failures to go unchecked. Because when people of color speak about the discrimination we face, we're met with skepticism, we're asked for proof, and when we give it, we're told it's an isolated incident. His voice dropped slightly, quieter but no less powerful. This was not an isolated incident. A ripple of unease passed through the room. This is a pattern, a system, a way of thinking that doesn't just live in one airline, one industry, or one country. It exists everywhere. And the only way to change it is to stop acting like it isn't happening. No one spoke. Richard let the silence stretch, watching them grapple with the truth of it. Then finally he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Now," he said, his voice sharp once more, "I expect every one of you to decide whether you want to be part of the solution, because I can promise you one thing, I will be." There was no need to say anything else. The message had been received. How often do we witness injustice but stay silent? How many times have we seen someone pulled aside, questioned, doubted, and told ourselves it wasn't our place to get involved? How many times have we convinced ourselves that it wasn't our problem, that someone else would step in, that maybe we were imagining things, that speaking up would be too uncomfortable? But here's the truth. Silence is a decision, too. Every passenger on that flight saw what happened. They saw Jordan and Xavier, two teenagers, being taken from their seats and escorted out of first class. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others watched, their lips pressed together, choosing not to speak. Not one person stood up. Not one person asked, "Are you sure? Did you check? Do they actually need to leave?" And that is how these moments keep happening. Because discrimination isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the pause before scanning a boarding pass, the doubt before offering a handshake, the lingering stare that says, "Are you supposed to be here?" without ever saying a word. If this story made you feel angry, frustrated, or even just uncomfortable, don't ignore that feeling. Because this isn't just about one flight. This isn't just about Jordan and Xavier. This is about every person who has ever had to prove their right to exist in a space they already earned. So if you felt something, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Because the more we talk about it, the harder it becomes to pretend it isn't real. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone is being treated unfairly, someone will finally speak up. Stories like this shouldn't just make us angry, they should make us act. Because the truth is, this isn't about just one flight. It's not about one mistake or one employee's bad judgment. It's about the thousands of moments, just like this one, that happen every single day, most of which never make the news, never go viral, never get justice. For every Jordan and Xavier who had someone fighting for them, there are countless others who are dismissed, ignored, and forced to accept that this is just the way things are. But that's the thing, isn't it? It doesn't have to be. Change doesn't happen in boardrooms. It doesn't happen in policy updates buried in an employee handbook. It happens in real life, in the choices we make when we see something that isn't right. It happens when someone questions a decision instead of blindly accepting it. When a person refuses to stay silent just because it's easier. When someone, anyone, has the courage to say, "No, this isn't okay." So if this story resonated with you, don't just scroll past it. Talk about it, comment on it, share it. Because the more we talk about it, the harder it becomes to pretend it doesn't exist. And the next time someone assumes you don't belong, make sure they never forget who you are.